Welcome to Ancient Philosophy Lecture 12. Today we're going to be looking at a section in the Theaetetus. It's part 2 of the Theaetetus. It begins with Theaetetus' idea that knowledge is true belief and then progresses to 5 puzzles of false belief. So we'll try to figure out what's going on there and then ends with an interesting example. So let's go ahead and jump in. What we've seen in the previous section is that it's a discussion of the thesis that knowledge is perception, and we saw how Plato linked that with Protagorean relativism and the Heraclitean doctrine of the flux, and we saw a really interesting argument that relativism is false, that knowledge is not perception, and so on. And so what we get from the conclusion of the previous section is that knowledge is not found in our bodily experiences, but in our reasonings about those experiences. So the claim that knowledge is judgment about immediate sensory awareness, it raises a question about how judgments or beliefs can emerge from immediate sensory awareness. So this is an empiricist proposal. So empiricism in general is the idea that the source for our beliefs, the source in terms of the content of our beliefs, the concepts of our beliefs, that the source is in sensation, and also the idea that the way we know claims comes from sensation. So what Plato is going to be wrestling with in this section is a question of how it's possible that beliefs are true or false if they come from sensations. Sensations don't have truth value. Sensations, in a way, you can think of as objects in the mind. Right? They are not true, they're not false, they're just objects. And so the question is, well, our beliefs are about the world. They're things that can be true or false. And so how is that possible? How can you get things that have a truth value from things that don't have a truth value? So Plato's project in this section that we're looking at is not to figure out how there could be false judgment. That's granted that there is false judgment, but it's rather to figure out how can empiricism be true given that there's false beliefs. And so the puzzles that we're going to look at, they're intended, of course, to be puzzling, but they're also intended to show a serious problem with empiricism. Now, this is going to fit in with Plato's overall project of arguing for rationalism, arguing for the claim that there's some knowledge that isn't based on sensation or the senses. As we've seen with Plato's account of recollection, as we've seen with Plato's idea that the highest good is knowledge of the form of the good, and that this is something that a person can approach through training as they begin to think about more and more abstract matters. They discern not just beautiful things, but they're able to discern beauty itself, this abstract form by which or in which beautiful things participate. So for Plato, it's very important that he substantiate the idea that the mind has within it a power to grasp being and to grasp truth that is not dependent on the senses. So let's start off here with the first puzzle of misidentification. Suppose empiricism is true and you know of, say, a red ball and, say, a green square, that this is red and this is green. There's a question, how could you confuse red from green? They're two different sensations, right? It's very difficult to determine how one could think that the red is green or the green, right, is red, because they have completely two different characters. So how could you confuse a red sensation with a green sensation? But we do know that false judgment is possible. If we see, for example, Theaetetus at a distance, and we see Socrates, for example, at a distance, we might think that, oh, there is Theaetetus. So that we would confuse Theaetetus and Socrates. We would think in a way that Theaetetus is Socrates. Or we could think, similarly that Socrates is Theaetetus. What is going on in that case? Right? For an empiricist, right, they might think, okay, well, we have a mental image of Socrates. And we have a distinct mental image of Theaetetus. And when you think that Theaetetus is Socrates, somehow or another you're judging that these two distinct mental images are the same. But how is that possible? How is that possible if we're understanding the image of Theaetetus and we're understanding the image of Socrates to be akin or similar to an image of redness and an image of greenness? It seems like it's impossible to confuse red and green. Similarly, with the empiricist story, it would be impossible to confuse a mental image of Socrates and a distinct mental image of Theaetetus. So there's a general problem here for the empiricist about explaining how mental images can be confused with each other, or how they can be joined together at all to form a judgment. So remember, when you judge that Socrates is Theaetetus, that's a judgment. You're saying that one thing is another thing. Let's think about it this way. So suppose you have a picture of Superman, and you have a picture of Clark Kent. Just a standard picture. You want to represent in the world the judgment that Superman is Clark Kent. Well, if you put the two pictures right close together, putting them right next to each other isn't going to represent that Superman is Clark Kent. In order to make that judgment that Superman is Clark Kent, you have to perform a distinct mental act. That is, you have to form a judgment. That you're saying that this one thing is this other thing. And that's something you can't do just by geometrical relationships. That's a unique power of the mind. So there's a puzzle here for the empiricist of how one can, in a way, make mental judgments given all the empiricist has to work with, in this case, is just images. So let's move on to the second puzzle. All right, so the second puzzle here is the puzzle of believing what is not. So when we have a belief, and that belief is false, we're judging something that is not the case. Now, what is not the case doesn't exist. It's not out there in the world. So you might be led to think that false belief is nothing. That is, when we have a belief about a thing, suppose we believe that Socrates is Theaetetus. This belief is false. But there's nothing in the world answering to this belief that we have. There's no true identity. Socrates isn't Theaetetus. So there's a puzzle here. What is this belief about? The puzzle here is what object is there out there in the world that answers, right, to this false belief that you have? Now, you might say that, well, look, a false belief is just a mental attitude, the attitude of belief, the attitude of endorsing a certain content. That is endorsing a proposition, and that proposition isn't true. But then the question is, okay, well, what is a proposition? Now, you might say a proposition is the meaning of a sentence. So that sentences in different languages, for example, can express the same thought. They can have the same meaning. But then the question is, okay, well, what are these things? And you might say, well, propositions in general are abstract objects, but that isn't consistent with empiricism, which says that everything in the mind comes from the senses. So in a way, it comes from things that are in the world. And then the question is, all right, well, how do you make sense of this, given empiricism? For a very simple version of empiricism, you can see what the problem is here. What object is there in the world that answers, right, to the object of a false belief? So empiricism here wrongly identifies believing with having a mental image. Like we've seen this before in the example I gave earlier of Clark Kent and Superman. If we have a mental image of Clark Kent and we have a mental image of Superman, we believe, right, that Clark Kent is Superman. We can't identify that attitude with just the having of those two mental images. We can't, in a way, say, well, look, we're just putting these two mental images together, because as we saw in the picture example, it doesn't work. Like if you're trying to represent that Clark Kent is Superman and you have a picture on your wall of Clark Kent and you have a picture on your wall of Superman, if you want to put those two together to represent that Clark Kent is Superman, just putting them right next to each other isn't going to express the proposition that they're identical. Right? So there's some special act of the mind that's required to judge that Clark Kent is Superman. Similarly, empiricism wrongly identifies with believing what is with having a mental image. So when you believe that Clark Kent is Superman, what mental image is there that corresponds to Clark Kent being Superman? It's a judgment that the mind makes. Okay, so let's move on to the third puzzle. Okay, so the third puzzle is the puzzle of allodoxia. This is the puzzle of other judging. Now, the explanation given here is that a false belief is when you judge that one thing is another thing. You sort of confuse two different things. So we might, for example, judge that red is green, and we confuse the two. We confuse a red object with a green object. But it's never explained how this is possible. So let's look, for example, at 190b. So Socrates says in 190b, well, now try to remember, if you've ever said to yourself that beautiful is certainly ugly, or that unjust is just. So the way Socrates is thinking this, a belief in a way is like an internal declaration. You're in a way talking to yourself. And have you ever, if you judge falsely that a beautiful person is ugly, that you're judging that the beautiful is ugly? Or to put it generally, ask yourself whether you've ever set out to persuade yourself that one of two things is certainly the other. Like, for example, the red is the green. Or quite the contrary, you've never, even in your sleep, had the face to say to yourself that odd is in fact even, or anything else of that kind. What Socrates is saying here is that it's difficult to see how other judging could be possible. How will you mistake one thing for another thing? Again, it's this puzzle that the empiricist faces, that if a person has mental images of things, the empiricist can't explain how it's possible to confuse these mental images. Now what we're going to get next is we're going to get two analogies to help us understand the way memory works and the way knowledge may function. And this is supposed to help us understand the puzzle of false belief, but in a way that isn't going to help solve the problems for empiricism. So the fourth puzzle here centers on the wax tablet analogy. The purpose of the wax tablet analogy is just to provide a simple view of memory. So the suggestion is that when you learn something, when you have a certain experience, it is like an impression that is formed on a wax tablet that's in the mind. Now Plato has a lot of really interesting things to say about the differences in aptitude and memory using this sort of analogy. With the wax tablet, we're not going to go into that. We're just going to focus on this puzzle of false belief. Let's continue the example that we've been using. You judge that Theaetetus is Socrates. Well, that's because you've on this view, you've had experiences of both Theaetetus and Socrates, and that there's an imprint of Theaetetus, and there's an imprint of Socrates in the wax tablet. And what you do is you have this perception of what turns out to be Socrates, and you look in the wax tablet and you misapply the Theaetetus image in the wax tablet. And that may be, on account of the fact that the image in the tablet doesn't match well with the true image of Theaetetus. But it matches enough, right, to be about Theaetetus, and it matches enough also in this case to where you misapply it to Socrates. So that now you have the false belief that Theaetetus is Socrates. So what's happening in this example is we can think of, you see Socrates in the distance. And you have in the wax tablet, you have an image of Socrates and you have an image of Theaetetus. You have this imprint of Socrates and this imprint of Theaetetus. And they aren't perfect pictures in a way of Theaetetus and Socrates. And so you see Socrates in the distance and you're looking right at your wax tablet there, and you're saying, that perceptual image matches really well this imprint in the wax tablet. But that imprint in the wax tablet turns out you've got the Theaetetus imprint. And so you judge that the perceptual object, right, is Theaetetus. So you're saying, this kind of matches pretty well, and so you judge that Theaetetus is Socrates, and this turns out to be a false belief. So let's see what Socrates has to say here. So he says on 193c, well then, we're left with the possibility of judging what's false in the following case. I know you and Theodorus, and I have imprints of the two of you on that piece of wax, like those of signet rings. I see both of you some way off and not properly, and I'm eager to assign the imprint which belongs to each to the scene which belongs to each, and to insert and fit the scene into its own trace, so that recognition may take place. But missing that aim and making a transposition, I attach the scene of each one to the imprint which belongs to the other, like people who put their shoes on wrong feet, or alternatively my going wrong is because the same sort of thing happens to me as happens to sight in mirrors, when it flows in such a way as to transpose left and right. And then Plato says it's then that different judging and the making of false judgments occur. So in 194b, he summarizes this. He says it's precisely in the case of things we both know and perceive that judgment is twisted and turned about, coming to be false as well as true. So, essential to the empiricist model of false judgment with a wax tablet is that you have now, in a way, two sources of knowledge. You have your perceptual knowledge, things that are experienced, these sensations, and then you have in the mind something akin to a wax tablet that's able to preserve a simulacrum or an image or an imprint of sensation. Now, it's crucial and essential for this model that it's an empiricist model. So Plato rejects this on the grounds that it doesn't account for false judgment in the case of arithmetic. So if you judge that 7 plus 5 is 11, that is a false judgment, but it's not explained how that's possible, given that there's no sensation that corresponds to 7 and no sensation that corresponds to 5. Okay, so the wax tablet analogy is useful for thinking about perceptual objects, but it's not helpful when judgment concerns mathematical or logical truths. So Plato turns to another image of the mind, the aviary. So here the idea is that false belief is possible because people have knowledge that's stored in the aviary, and a person has active knowledge that's consciously brought to mind, and false belief arises because a person selects the wrong piece of knowledge. In the aviary, the idea is that there are two ways in which you could possess knowledge. You could initially acquire knowledge, which would be akin to like acquiring a bird in the hand. And then you put the bird in the aviary. And so the bird is enclosed within a space, but it's flying around, so it's not in your hand. And Plato thinks that this is maybe the way memory can work, is that you've learned something, right, and then it's stored in memory. But in a way, there's two ways of knowing it. There's this dispositional sense that if given enough time, you could recall it. You could select the bird out of the aviary and hold it in your hand. But then there's another sense, this occurrent sense of knowledge in which you have the bird in hand. You are actively thinking about something. And so Plato thinks that it may provide a picture of false belief in that you are thinking about one thing. You have one particular bird in the hand, so to speak, and you think that it is like or akin or the same thing to a bird that's flying around in the cage. And that bird, it's in the cage, so there's a sense in which you know it, but there's another sense in which you don't know it. So there's one problem here that Plato is still worried about. And Plato is still worried about the fact that we really haven't gotten an explanation of how we can confuse two mental images. The other problem for empiricism here is very similar, is that the birds in the cage have to come from sensation, right? So Plato is going to again focus on this mathematical case. How can a person think that 5 plus 7 is 11? So we can get at this by focusing on this question. We can ask, what item of knowledge is activated when a person answers the question, what is the sum of 5 plus 12? And so we could in a way think about this. We have these various birds that are flying around in the aviary. And so when we query, what is the sum of 5 and 12? You can think we reach in and grab the bird that in a way is analogous to 12. So what we're saying here is that the atom of knowledge that's activated is 12. Well then, if that's the case, when a person is asking what's the sum of 5 and 7 and it activates 12, how is it possible for a person to confuse 11 with 12? How is that possible? There's nothing in the aviary analogy that would allow us to answer that question in a way that makes sense. I mean, you're holding 12, right, in your hand, so to speak. Okay, so suppose, right, it activates 11. So a different bird, so to speak, is grabbed, right? And it's the bird that corresponds to 11. Well, in this case, what's going on? How does the person judge that 5 and 7, the sum of 5 and 7 is 11? How is that possible? And so just providing, right, this aviary model of that, oh, well, you just selected the wrong bird, and then you, in a way, had this mental act of identifying the two, and so you judge that 5 and 7 is 11. That is a description of the case, but it's not an explanation of the case. It doesn't illuminate us about how it is possible to judge falsely in this case. So that's what needs to be explained. So the empiricist here needs to be able to distinguish the sum of 5 and 7 as a mental image from 12 as a mental image. In a way, it's an open challenge to the empiricist here. I mean, Plato thinks that it's inadequate, and so this is a sustained argument, right, against empiricism. So what's going on here in the background is an attempt to answer the question, what sort of knowledge do you need to have about X in order to have a belief about X? Right? What sort of knowledge do you need to have about 5 and 7 and its sum in order, right, to have the appropriate kinds of beliefs? Now, we can certainly imagine someone who thinks of the sum of 5 and 7 as 2, and the sum of 3 and 7 as 2, and the sum of, say, 7 and 7 is 2. We think, okay, well, maybe this person doesn't have beliefs about what sum is. Maybe they are mistaken in terms of the function that's being expressed here. Maybe they don't understand arithmetic enough. So in that case, we wouldn't say that they have a false belief about the sum of 5 and 7 necessarily. I mean, we would say that there's a deeper confusion here. They haven't grasped the right kind of, they don't have the right kind of beliefs. They haven't grasped what's going on in the question that's being asked. So there's a puzzle here about how to fill out what kind of knowledge a person needs to have in order to attribute them with beliefs. And then how does that fit in with empiricism? Okay, so we get these 5 puzzles, and the puzzles are intended to indicate that there's a serious problem with a simple version of empiricism. Empiricism doesn't have the resources to answer in general these puzzles of false belief, because we need not only an adequate model of the mind that would explain how judgment is possible and how false judgment is possible, we need an adequate model of the mind that's able to explain how mathematical judgment is possible and how false, mathematical and logical judgments are possible. Okay, so let's turn here to the final part that I want to focus on in this reading. This is this section that returns back to Theaetetus' original answer at the start of this question, that knowledge is true judgment. Remember that Theaetetus proposes, in response to the refutation of Heraclitus and Pythagoras and such, that, knowledge isn't perception. So what's knowledge? And he says it's true judgment. And then Socrates says, well, look, there really are these puzzles about false judgment. So he talks the majority of the section about those puzzles, which is, as I've been saying, is a sustained argument against empiricism. And so now he returns to this, and it's a simple counterexample, which will set us up for the next section, trying to provide a more adequate account of knowledge. So Theaetetus says knowledge is true judgment. He says what it has going for it is that knowledge is free from error, so you can't know things that are false, which is correct. And he says that everything that follows from knowledge is admirable and good. So this should remind you of the Meno, where Plato gives the example of knowing one's way to Larissa, and he says that a person who has true belief about how to get to Larissa doesn't know because they haven't actually, they don't have eyewitness knowledge. They haven't actually been to Larissa. And he points out there that knowledge is more valuable than true belief, but that the value of knowledge lies in the fact that knowledge is more secure than true belief. And so there's a sense here in which everything that follows from true judgment isn't as admirable as knowledge, because true judgment, as also is pointed out in the Meno, has a tendency to walk away, like the statues of Daedalus. That you need some sort of account to tie true judgment down. It provides a stable basis for action. Okay, so the counterexample to the claim that knowledge is true judgment. So Socrates here focuses on people who are speech makers and litigants. He says, because those people, you see, persuade others by means of their art, not teaching them, but making them judge whatever they want them to judge. Right, so these are people trained in the art of persuading or convincing people without having them go through the process of Socratic dialectic. Or do you think there are people who are so clever as teachers that in a short time allowed by the clock, they can teach the truth about what happened to people who weren't there when some others were being robbed of money or otherwise violently treated? He continues, so when jurymen have been persuaded in accordance with justice about things which it's possible to know only if one has seen them and not otherwise, then in deciding those matters by hearsay and getting hold of a true judgment, they have decided without knowledge, though what they have been persuaded of is correct, given that they have reached a good verdict. So he's thinking, we can, these litigants, speech makers, sophists, can persuade an individual of something that's true, but because that isn't tied down in the soul by way of dialectic, by way of an account, it doesn't amount to knowledge. In a way, it's just a lucky true belief. So this then moves on to Theaetetus' next account, that knowledge is true belief plus an account. And what we get next is Socrates' dream theory, which is really interesting. And so I want to talk about that in a separate video. And then also I want to talk about 3 ways to understand logos. So I'll put that up in the next video. So I hope you guys are enjoying thinking about these puzzles of false beliefs. Enjoy thinking about empiricism and rationalism. So if you have any questions, again, send me an email. I look forward to reading your thoughts and hearing your comments.